Welcome everyone tonight. I'm so excited to have Jake joining our class and telling you about his story. Jake is a former patient of mine. I treated him while he was at Spalding Rehab, and he's going to tell you all about that. When he and I first met, Jake was totally nonverbal, unable to speak or communicate verbally with me or anyone else. And he'll probably go into that. But now he's had this kind of amazing recovery, and he's going to tell you about his experience. And then also, this is a time for you to have a really unique opportunity to get a firsthand account from a patient who's kind of been through an amazing illness and recovery. And if you missed it, Jake had mentioned a few minutes ago, if you just logged on, Jake said, nothing is off the table. Ask him anything. He's an open book. He wants any question that pops up. So how the questions will work is Jake is gonna talk to us for the first half or so of this session and just tell us about his story, and then at the end, in the second half, we'll open it up to Q&A. So I think the best thing to do is, if you have a question, if you would like to ask Jake a question or get in line to ask him a question, send me a message letting me know that you have a question for him, and I'll have a list of people kind of queued up for when we do take Q&A. We're not going to take questions during Jake's presentation about his story, but if he says something that you say, oh, I want to ask about that, just shoot me a note and say, I want to ask Jake a question, and then when we switch over to the Q&A portion, I'll have your name in queue. So just for those who are on video, shake your head, nod, does that make sense? Okay, great. Are there any questions before we begin? Now is the time. Okay. So I will keep my eye on the chat, and without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Jake.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to give you a very brief background before my illness, and then I'll go into everything that led it up to locked-in syndrome. Basically, I grew up in Sudbury, Massachusetts, a good community. I was a trained chef. I worked hard and partied hard, and smoking opiates led me to my traumatic brain injury. So May 24th, 2017, I was diagnosed with toxic acute progressive leukoencephalopathy. They told me that I had a chance to survive, but odds are I pretty much had 6 months to live, and that it would rapidly deteriorate. And they broke it down step by step. So it's like, at first you lose your movements, then your ability to swallow, talk, locked in. And that's what happened over, I would say, about 5 months. I was bedridden, and I had a very faint speech, barely. I was like whispering. So by end of December, they thought I would die, but I didn't die. I became completely locked in, meaning I could not even blink. All I had was involuntary vertical eye movements. So they thought I was comatose. In reality, I was watching and listening to everything. So, okay, that happened for a few months. I was put on hospice. So if you survive hospice for so long, they eventually kick you off after 6 months. So at that point, I was moved back to Mass General Hospital because they didn't really know what to do with me. I was essentially in what appeared to be a vegetative state when I was there. Around July 4th, 2018, I remember hearing the fireworks outside Mass General and just thinking like, there's no way I can stay like this forever. And that was really my biggest fear. It wasn't so much dying at that point. It was being trapped like this forever. So that kind of gave me, when it was kind of hopeful, I was like, I'm gonna push through, I'm gonna do whatever I can. I'm gonna break out of being locked in. So it started with a minor right wrist movement that luckily my internal medicine doctor, while he was doing rounds with a variety of people, noticed. And it was like, guys, do you see that movement in the right wrist? It's very subtle. So then they were like, yeah, we see it. The neurology team, they were like, this is involuntary movements. And he disagreed and was like, we need someone from speech pathology here to try and get him to like signal to us if he can hear us. So that's when I first was introduced to my first speech pathologist when I started to recover. This lady was like, she was not aware that I was quote unquote in there, but she talked to me like it was, which was really refreshing because no one really talked to me as if I was in the room ever. Um, so I remember her saying, you gotta try and blink for me. It was a few days of this. Eventually I started to be able to blink. And then they started off with, blink if you can hear me, I blinked. They were like, blink if you know where you are, I blinked. Again, the neurology team. No, this has gotta be false positive. There's no way by his brain scan. Look at his brain stem, he's not in there. So then they would be like, okay, Jake, don't blink. So I didn't blink. They'd be like, blink if you're cold. I didn't blink. They were like, blink if you're hot. I blinked. They were like, blink if you know the president. I blinked. They tried to like trick me up and they couldn't get me wrong. So during this time, I was fully aware. I was always fully aware, but I mean, I was really like, I gotta break through. So then, about the 5th day, probably July 9th of 2018, the speech pathologist was like, Jake, I need you to stick out your tongue. And I tried as if, imagine if you were bench pressing 500 pounds. That's like the amount of effort. I was like trying to stick out my tongue. And I remember thinking to myself, ah, shit, I can't do it. And all of a sudden I hear, oh my God, he's doing it. And they're like, Jake, that's good enough. That'll be your yes. So blink for no, stick out your tongue for yes. Tell me if you understand. So I stick out my tongue. That's when they introduced me to a letterboard. For those of you who don't know, a very simple AIEOU board where you basically they would point to a letter since I had no movement and I would stick out my tongue for yes on which letter I wanted. And that was my first nonverbal communication. It was, I can hear you. They were like blown away by this. Then they started talking about amongst themselves. There was probably speech pathology, neurology, internal medicine, a whole variety of caregivers. And they were all like, we gotta get them to Spalding rehab. they're like the only place aside from Children's Hospital that could really like specialize in nonverbal augmentative technology. We gotta know what's going on in this guy's head. So one of the guys said, but he's not a rehab candidate. He'll never be accepted. He cannot do the 3 hours of therapy that is a requirements. So I start like blinking and sticking out my tongue, and like luckily the speech pathologist was there. My heart rate was like spiking. They're like, "Calm down, Jake, calm down." Like, do you want to use the letterboard? I repeatedly stuck out my tongue. I spelled out, I can do 3 hours. And that was the real moment of like, wow, he's not only like somewhat cognitively in there, he's actually like following our conversation. So it was then that I got moved to Spalding, where I met Michelle. And just a side note here, when Michelle first heard about me, she was like, who is this guy coming from hospice? You know, like, he's not a rehab candidate. What are we gonna even do with him? So this is like a very good point for future speech pathologists. The notes are not always exactly accurate. So Michelle took the initiative and called the speech pathologist at MGH that just pretty much be like, what's going on here? What's the deal? So I don't know what was said, but she got a good idea, and
In my defense, I didn't think there was nothing we could do with you. I had never seen a patient come to rehab from hospice. That had never, in my clinical experience, I had never seen that happen before, and I was totally surprised. And I kind of thought, what's going on? This guy seems to be going in the other direction. And that's when I called Jen, and she gave me the full scoop. And sometimes that's kind of how you have to get the full story, is by talking to the other therapists.
Yes, and even my current speech therapist mentioned this to me today. She's like, we have people in their chart it says nonverbal. Then I walk into the room and they say, hi, how are you? And really they were just very sick and not talking. So it's always a good rule of thumb to investigate on your patients before you meet them. Anyway, okay, moving on. So I get the swelling, which I knew was a miracle. I was lucky to be there. I was lucky to be alive, but really lucky to be at Spalding, because I really didn't meet any rehabilitation guidelines anywhere. And Spalding, as you probably know, is one of the world's premier places to be. So I was in extreme pain, but I was just willing to do whatever it took. And the Spalding team, there were times there were times where I wanted to give up, and my doctors, my therapists, as they got to know me, they kept on me to just keep fighting. That was something I really needed during that time. Not sure I'd be here today if it wasn't for that. Okay, so let me talk about some speech therapy stuff with me and Michelle. So we started off with the letterboard, and I was quite good at this, but there was a learning curve for majority of the staff. They were like, we don't know how to use this, or like, yeah, there was just a large learning curve, and it was definitely frustrating. But moving on, we eventually, Michelle introduced me to the Megabee. So that's a nonverbal communication device that I had to use because my eye tracking systems we had tried wouldn't work. My eyes weren't properly tracking. But correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know what is the difference exactly with the Megabee, but it's just easier to spot, I guess.
I'll help clarify a little bit. The eye tracking
Yeah.
system we were testing out with you was there was a digital system with a video camera, and it would look at Jake's iris and see where his eye was tracking to, and if it could get a good reading of his iris, then it could visually display a letter board or a phrase board or any number of things. Because it was a digital system, you could program it to say whatever you wanted, and you could use a steady eye gaze to quickly and consistently choose the right message. But because of Jake's positioning and posturing and other physical issues he was dealing with at the time, we couldn't get a steady read. So that wasn't a consistent or efficient way for him to communicate. So we then used the Megabee, which is considered a low-tech system, which you guys will actually learn about later in the semester. And it still uses eye tracking, but it was a system where it's kind of a board, and I look through the middle of it and I can see where Jake is looking, and I can see what combination of letters and colors he's looking at to come up with his message. That's a quick recap of what it is.
Yeah. So at first I was like, I understood it, but I was like, I don't feel like this will be any faster than the letterboard. But Michelle sat down me and was like, trust me, once you learn this, you'll breeze through, like you can really type full paragraphs. And she was right. I mean, I became very good at the Megabee, and that was the first point that I was really able to communicate for non-essential needs. So like with the letterboard, it was all about like, I'm thirsty, I'm hot, I'm hungry, whatever. I'm in pain. The Megabee allowed me to like actually have in-depth conversations. And all right, moving on from that. So we started practicing diaphragmatic breathing and trying to get me to vocalize any sound. Again, this was similar to me bench pressing 500 pounds. That's how hard I was trying. And I forget exactly how this went, but it was like, I would use a Megabee and I would be like, my feet hurt. Michelle would be like, look, Jake, speech therapy doesn't cause pain. Like, I forget the specifics. But
I think it was when you were trying to vocalize.
yeah,
It was such a full body effort, and at the time you were casted. Both of your feet were casted.
right, exactly.
And so he was literally using his entire body to try to make a sound, and he was pressing his feet, which were they were casting him to because they were kind of flexed too much.
Very much.
And very much. And it was painful for him. And every time he would try to make a voice, he was using his whole body to do it, and he would press up against the casts. And that took me a while to figure out.
So I forget I remember that, but I forget your initial response to that.
You were being a baby and to keep working.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much, which I'm glad they did. So I did make eventually a verbal sound with Michelle, but it was never anything too consistent. I think maybe on 3 occasions I verbalized. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you
So
said there was one session where you said "I love you." That
yeah,
came out, and there were a couple of single words, but it was only ever one or two words, and it was very
yeah,
consistent.
yeah. So I got transferred from Spalding again. They didn't really know what to do with me or who would accept me. I went to Western Massachusetts Hospital. The social worker,
I just want to bring up one more thing so that they're aware that this was an element of your plan too, is that you were at that time on a feeding tube and you weren't eating anything by mouth. And so another thing that we did in our sessions was we tried to
yeah,
practice eating as well.
yeah, that is true. You're kind of freezing for me,
I know it froze
but
for a second, but I think it's clearing up now.
so yeah, that's true. I remember drinking smoothies with you, but I want to get to the Q&A, so I'm trying to squeeze in like a 15 to 24-hour seminar in 25 minutes here. So we, I get to Western Mass, and I didn't make any verbal noise for about 2 months, and they were very worried about that. Another thing you can probably tell by my facial movements, they are off. And that was a big thing we focused on at Western Mass with speech pathology. It was exercising my facial muscles and getting more movement. They showed me what I looked like in a mirror. That was a very depressing day for me. I had no idea how I looked. I was, the best way to describe this is stroke face. And just, I had like a very, like no expression, no wrinkles. It's a work in progress. Anyway, I started to verbalize vowels in January of 2019. I did have to kick my leg in order to do this. Also, I could only do this laying flat on a mat, which is probably goes against everything you're learning about. Again, I'm just like, I'm the exception to the rule. So, you know, as the months go on, I start saying phrases, I start talking to the point where we can really focus on different blends of sounds. And, you know, cognition was never my issue, which probably will be if you go into brain injury with most of your patients. So, like, I never had to relearn the English language. It was more about coordinating my mouth to make and my tongue to make the proper sounds. I remember S blends were really difficult. P's and B's, they always sounded the same. Uh, so let me get into a little bit about the swallowing. So my feeding tube was, you know, they introduced me to a pureed diet. I still had my feeding tube in. I was on putting thick water, which you probably know is awful. Um, but you know, they kept motivating me. They were like, if you ever want to drink again, this is what you gotta do. You go to pudding, then honey, then nectar, then a little thicker, and then thin. And so I really took that to heart, and I was like, even though this is making me gag, I gotta do what I gotta do to get here. So, the water, the food progressed. They were able to remove my feeding tube in, I believe, May of 2019. And I was on basically a full diet. Only restriction was mixed consistency for a while. That's now gone. However, I still have to take pills with applesauce or something and tuck my chin in order to swallow. I probably had 30 swallow tests just at Western Mass. I had a few with you, Michelle, a few as I was getting sicker. I've had a lot. But I think that's a good point to open up the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Jake.
What do you think?
I think that's a perfect spot to
Okay.
It's such your story is so, there's so many elements of it, and it's so amazing in so many ways. Like, it's so hard to do a quick 30-minute recap of what would be like hours and hours, but you did hit on some of the points of your rehab and recovery. You brought up some of the speech pathology elements. And so now we'll kind of open it up to the group. I do have, so like I said before, just shoot me a chat. You don't have to tell me what your question is, because I want you to ask the question to Jake. Just say, I want to ask a question, and that way I'll know who to call on, because right now there's so many, a lot of people's videos aren't on, which is fine, and there's too many to scroll through. So just send me a little message.
If you have any questions for me, feel free.
All right, I'll definitely come up with the few.
Especially with the speech pathology stuff. Because I do have a lot of insights, like a lot. So,
One thing that kind of stuck with me before I go to the questions, which send me a note now if you want to ask a question. That was the first time that I've ever heard you talk about the difference between using the letterboard and the Megabee, and how the letterboard you were really just kind of communicating like your basic needs. I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm hot.
Yeah.
But the Megabee allowed you to, for the first time in, I think at that point had been over a year, to communicate more complex thoughts and emotions. And I know a lot of our sessions were some pretty heavy stuff that we were communicating. And
so I don't know if you remember, I actually had a psychologist that you probably trained on the Megabee. That was like epic. That was huge.
I totally forgot about that, but you're right. I trained,
So, I also was able to speak to my physical therapist on a more personal level, just about like, she'd be like, hey, Jake, what are you thinking? She would grab the Megabee and I could go on for hours, but that was a big difference. Letterboards are really for like essential needs. And honestly, at that point, that was good enough. I mean, coming out of locked-in syndrome, a letterboard, even the yes and no before the letterboard, were like major milestones.
And coming from my perspective as your therapist during that time, a huge element of what I was doing with Jake was a lot of staff education as well about how to communicate. And so the Megabee and the letterboards, and it's not common knowledge, nor
I'm really glad you brought that up. There was extreme issues with that, even at Spalding, even worse than Western Mass. So I don't know if you know this, but when I got to Western Mass, I was told there'd be a Megabee waiting for me. They had shipping issues from Belgium. It didn't arrive for 2 months. So it's back to the letterboard.
And that's, I mean, if you can imagine, that's your only way to communicate in with any type of efficiency, and so it's almost like your right to communicate was taken away from you by not having that there ready for you.
Okay, and there was something else I want to mention. So as I started to recover more and more, probably in May, I got the very iPad I'm talking to you on now that was given by a agency. I think it's IOP or IUB. They basically give out iPads to people who are nonverbal.
Oh,
And
that's good.
so that was huge for me. And at this point, I had no real movements. So it was all voice control, mainly Siri. And as you can imagine, as I began to learn how to talk, I was nowhere near the level I'm at now. This is just one funny story. I would say like, hey Siri, send email to Dr. blah blah blah. And would like eventually on my 15th try open the email. And I was like, I think I just wanted to say like all I could do was simple short phrases. I think I was saying I need to talk to you, but Siri heard free porn.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so then Siri's like, do you want me to send this? I'm like, no, 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 no. Okay, I'll send it.
No.
Yeah.
So that's the other, because I remember you asking me, some of the talk to text apps are not great. And so and the reason, I think, I'm not sure if you explained this, but the reason why you're using talk to text is because you still have difficulty with fine motor control.
Yeah.
Right? So you're not able to text or type it.
My hands weren't like locked like this.
Yeah.
And also like on Friday I'm going to ATEC at Spalding to my new Surface Pro with Dragon speech recognition.
That's
so
awesome.
Yeah. So okay, on to questions. Yeah.
All right, so on to questions. So the first question is from Raquel. Raquel, I'll let you ask the question to Jake.
Okay. Hi. Thanks for chatting with us today.
Yeah. How are you?
Good. I'm good. How are you?
Very good.
Thanks for chatting.
Yeah.
So I currently work with people like radiology. I do MRIs on kids and infants. And you mentioned your brain scans, so that really drew my attention. You said that they had originally seen your brain scans and said that there was no way that you would be able to communicate.
Yeah.
But you did, which is amazing.
Right.
And so I wonder if they ever went back and rescanned you more recently to see if there are changes in your brain now.
I'm really glad you mentioned this. So yes, I've had a number of MRIs throughout my recovery. However, there were no visible changes at all. They are exactly the same. And the only explanation they can give me, which is quite vague, is neuroplasticity, meaning there are new connections being made that are not visible. Like clearly there's a lot going on in there that they cannot see. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Of course.
What are you working on in speech today?
Very good question. So prosody, inflection. Also, if you notice, I kind of bobble my head. That is like a technique I use to create the illusion of prosody and inflection, which I really hate. But, you know, it's all about baby steps. And then after you master it, you correct it. At least that's my idea behind this.
Thank you.
Because for a long time, even when I could talk, I would reaffirm my answer. They would be like, did you say this? And I would reaffirm by doing, and that was my yes. So it took me like months to break that habit. Yeah.
One thing I'll comment about Jake's prosody and just your speech in general is that when he was at Spalding, and I had kind of forgotten about this until we were just talking about it, he was nonverbal, obviously, and so we were trying to figure out why he was nonverbal, and this kind of relates to our voice module, because we were saying, is there a paralysis of the vocal cords? Why is it that he's not able to actually produce a voice? Because it could be at the structural level, it could be dysfunction with the vocal cords, it could be like an ataxic or a praxic approach to the coordination of the phonation and the respiration together. So we actually did, we scoped Jake to look at his vocal cords to see if they could move, which you love, Jake, because you got the little scope up the nose.
That was so fun.
And we did that scope, and we saw that his vocal cords were perfect. They looked beautiful.
So let me add to that. Yeah. On my YouTube channel, there was a recent video I posted about my neurological laryngology appointment, where they also so big again, and yeah, they function and they aren't quite sure what's going on, but they believe it's just coordination and it will get better with time.
Yep, and that was kind of my hypothesis when I was treating him, was once I knew that his vocal cords were totally intact and that they both moved fine, then to me it seemed that it was an issue of the coordination, which made sense because if you see the way Jake moves his arms and his legs, there's difficulty with coordination there as well. Oh. And we don't think about the fact that we need to coordinate respiration and phonation, but we do, and it's actually a very complex process. So that's Jake's exactly right, that once you know the cause of the difficulty, then you can practice it and work on it that way. Yeah. Okay, the next, I believe Emma has a question for you.
Cool.
Hi. I know you talked about like blinking to communicate in the very beginning, and like using the mega B. Yeah. And I was wondering if you remember any specific activities that you did with any form of communication in speech therapy that you felt were particularly helpful.
Can you like rephrase that? You froze for 1 second there. So are you asking with the mega B or after?
Just like any time throughout your time in speech therapy, like what activities have like stood out to you as being particularly helpful?
Well, I always liked to focus on the things that I had most difficulty with. For example, P's and B's. I mean, so there's an exercise, I forget what it's called, but you basically say like, okay, my example is a little vulgar, but this was literally what we did. She was like, pitch, bitch. So I would have to say pitch and bitch, but they would always come out as bitch, bitch. So like.
Those are called minimal pairs.
Yeah, so I mean, anything that was difficult for me, that's what I wanted to work on, which I imagine most patients want to steer away from that because it's like extra hard. But I mean, I'm an extremely motivated individual here. So,
that is
other ideas, let me think about that. Really getting my facial movements back were so important to me. And with my hour of speech every day about some math, 30 minutes was dedicated to like looking up, looking down without moving my head. He's like, different facial exercises, which is why I'm where I am now. Still not good, but a lot better.
Well, I mean, to me, it's amazing to see your facial expression the way that it is now, because it's like night and day. It's like you're a different person.
That's one thing I don't think we ever did. Look at my face,
no,
which was
we had bigger fish to fry.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when they did this in Western Mass, the speech pathologist was basically crying because she was like, I really didn't want to do that to you, but like, I didn't know if you were aware. And like, it was weird. I had like, if something actually made me smile, I could smile normally. If I was trying to fake a smile, I couldn't do it. So there was something going on with involuntary and voluntary movements of my face. Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question from Olivia.
Okay.
Hi.
Hello, Olivia.
So my question, I was looking at your blog and I read your most recent post about your experiences like just throughout your life. And so I was wondering if you could speak to your initial hospitalization, because I found it interesting your story kind of cut off as you were talking about being dope sick and then being hospitalized. So I was wondering if you could just speak to your experiences about being in the hospital and also that.
Sure. And the reason it cut off like that is because I'm making new blog posts every weekend, so it will eventually make sense. But I went in to the hospital, so I was quite sick without realizing I was sick probably even like a month before. But I realized something was really wrong with me 3 days before, and I was definitely an active addict, and I was so messed up then. But basically, I get to the hospital. My immediate thought after I was diagnosed in the morning, I'm starting to be dope sick, and I'm like, they just tell me I have 6 months to live, and this is like gonna get worse. So it was like, screw it, I'm gonna get high. So I called a buddy, had him bring me some to UMass Memorial in Worcester, and I lit it up right in my hospital bed, which is insane. I mean, I can't believe I did that. But yeah, a nurse walked in and was like, oh my God, what are you doing? Like, I barely lit a lighter. I was like already falling apart. And that's how screwed up I was. So I really went through the phase of like, I don't know if it's denial or like what you'd call it, but I realized what I had to do after one afternoon of like getting high. I was like, I can't do this. Like, I gotta fight for my life. I gotta fight for my family. Yeah. Is there anything like more specific within that?
I was just curious to get to hear a little bit more about your experiences like actually in a hospital, and you spoke to that perfectly, and it's so amazing that you feel so comfortable sharing this, because that is a really tough thing to talk about, and obviously I'm not so thank you for sharing, because that's really valuable.
Okay. One other thing I will mention is I was in extreme pain from the illness, which made dope sickness. I was also dope sick after I made the decision to stop for about 2 months. And like, I battled both of these. At the time, I thought dope sickness was the worst thing that a human could really experience. I was so wrong. The pain of this disease made double sickness look like a sneeze. So, like, even though I was double sick, I had much bigger things to worry about. Yeah. The real addictive thing that lasted for longer than opiates or cigarettes, I craved them for even like when I was on a feeding tube, I still have cravings for cigarettes, which is like, ugh. But yeah. Okay. Feel free to email me if there's anything else you think of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I believe Stephanie has a question for you as well.
Sure.
Hi, Jake. Thank you so much for taking time to chat with us today.
Of course. Hello, Stephanie.
Hi. I watched your Reddit AMA, and you mentioned that one of your long-term goals is to participate in the Boston Marathon in 2025, yes. Which is awesome. And I wish you all the best in that endeavor. And
that's a very ambitious goal.
Yeah, I think that's great.
But yeah.
And so I'm wondering, what are some of your other current, maybe short-term and long-term goals, and how have your goals changed from the start of your rehabilitation journey up until today?
Well, let me break this down in a few points. So, as you can tell, I'm very ambitious. There's a lot I want to accomplish. And like, I've been put in this rare situation. Like, no one thought I would even live, let alone verbalize one day. And now I'm like, I don't know, what do you think? Am I 90% intelligible or more? Or I don't know. But since I have this gift, I want to first off help nonverbal and locked in patients, because that is some of the most, it was almost worse than the pain, the being nonverbal, or being locked in rather, well, both. So I want to advocate for them, because I'm writing a book also, and one of my main chapters is being misunderstood. That's like a 400-page chapter of my book. I know I gotta time that down. Sorry, there's like a bug flying by my face. So yeah, I want to advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves. And recently I'm working on a transfer to a more intensive rehabilitation hospital. So I'm like a very good advocate for myself. I have the support of Spalding, MGH, family, a lot of different tools. And like, it seems to be impossible, even for someone that is such a good advocate. So recently I've been thinking, imagine the guy that's like not cognitively there, only with a healthcare proxy or power of attorney that has a full-time job, that has the best intentions, but really advocating to this magnitude that takes like more than a full-time job from one person. So that's something I want to do. I don't even know if this job exists, but I want to be like a rehab coach for all different rehabilitations. So obviously I have a past history with drugs. There's that part, but also like physical rehabilitation, because even when I was at Spalding, I was, nonverbal, but I was like looking around, listening to everything. One guy in the gym was like, I give up, no more, I give up. And they were like talking him out of it, but he was like, nope, discharge me, I'm done. And I found, I didn't know exactly what would happen, but I know now, and like they really do discharge you, and then that person either maintains where they're at or more likely deteriorates, and that's like really sad. So I feel like if I can push through something like this, you just gotta get over the hump. And so I want to like literally go next to these people and be like, you can do this, like you really can. So that's something I want to do. Shit, I have a whole list. I could go all day. But hopefully that gave you some insight.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing, Jake.
Yeah, of course.
I think you're giving everyone a little bit of a window into just what an amazing individual you are.
Well, thank you.
I think, let's see, we have a few more questions. One is from Catherine.
Hello, sorry.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. I just wanted to ask more of like a personal side of it, like knowing this journey was like so long and is still going. I would have to imagine that the support is from like family and friends must have been like so necessary for you. And I kind of was wondering if you could touch on kind of how that impacted you and how essential that was.
Okay, so this is a slightly complicated answer. So without going into too much detail, I can tell you that at the time I was at Mass General, after hospice, even during hospice, then Spalding, I had no one except my wife, now ex-wife. And that wasn't because that's what I wanted. That was kind of, for whatever reason, her rule. So, very complicated there. But essentially, I had no support aside from my caregivers at Spalding and then Western Mass. Eventually, I broke all communication with my wife, so I really had no one. Actually, my family was under the impression I died after hospice. So, it wasn't until the end of May 2019 where I could barely talk. I mean, I could talk, but I was like 50% intelligible. I randomly remembered a number to my aunt in Texas, and I FaceTimed her like out of the blue. She was like shocked. She was like, Jake, are you in heaven? And I was like, no, I'm alive, I can talk. Like, how are you? And she like freaked out, called her husband, was like making sure she wasn't hallucinating. So from that point on, I got reconnected with my siblings, my dad, my stepdad, and that's been huge. And also all my friends. So like, for like the beginning part of this journey, my real support was my wife and my providers. And it was luckily, I had a good bond with Michelle and my other therapists, and like same at Western Mass. As I began to talk, they realized my sense of humor, and that's strengthen the bond, and yeah, support is huge. So, I mean, as future speech pathologists, I really don't know from a teaching standpoint what you're supposed to do, but really making a connection, regardless if it carries over to personal after, is I think important, because it can make all the difference of like someone wanting to push forward or not. And a lot of my doctors just attribute my remarkable recovery to sheer willpower and drive. And I think that's true. Like, I was so fed up with being locked in that I like had to break out of that. Once I broke out of that, I was so fed up with being nonverbal, I had to break out of that. Once I started speaking, I was so fed up with no one understanding me, so I had to get better. So it's just like, I don't know, caregivers can definitely give support, even more so than family members sometimes. And that's the important thing to remember.
Thank you. That's really incredible. I would assume that you had the way that you are now and the way that you've come so far. I would assume that you had like never-ending support throughout the whole time. So that's really impressive.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, your next question is from Megan.
Okay.
There's so much pressure. We're winding down here. Hi.
We're gonna go a few minutes over because it took us a few minutes to get like kicked off and everything. So we're gonna go in for 5 or 10 more minutes. So take your time with your question.
Okay. So I like your telling about your early experiences with healthcare providers is like pretty upsetting. And knowing that many of us are aspiring speech language pathologists, but like also will be in healthcare settings. Talking about doing advocacy work. Sorry, this like question's not fully formed, I guess. I'm curious if you've gotten to speak to any of your previous healthcare providers, or if that's something you want to do in the future, just to like.
I've been in touch with like everybody. Are you referring to the negative comments I ever heard?
Yeah, just like, have you gotten to like speak to people since, or is that like a type of work that you want to like advocate for locked in patients in that way?
Yeah, I mean, you truly never know if they're listening, if they're not, if there are times of listening. You also brought up a really good point I want to mention. I think it's essential for anyone in speech pathology to check in every day with the patient and see if they can do something new, like maybe they can kick their foot, and that could be a signal of a yes. So like, for me, I feel like I'm not sure, maybe actually for me I had really good care, but for others there may be people in that situation that are like waiting for someone to come over and be like, ask me to blink or something. So you never know what will change overnight. And like, I still change rapidly daily, which is insane. But so no, I have not talked to anyone that was negative. Most of the negativity I experienced was either in the emergency room. They were really rough there. Just like, they were just talking like it wasn't even there. And then there were, I would say, a 80-20% split in the neuro ICU of like ones that would either 80% nice, 20% either silent or had negative remarks, not necessarily to me, but to their other coworker around me. And no, I have not got to speak with any of these people yet. I would like to. Not even to be like, hey, that was really mean what you said, but to be like, you know, by the way, like, I could hear you and maybe you should reconsider, like, speaking your mind. But I've been in touch with, like, everybody from Spalding, majority from Mass General, from, like, when I became unlocked, Western Mass. Yeah.
I think one thing I want to add to that,
Thank you.
I think that Jake's story and Jake's experience is a really good example of how someone's ability to communicate clearly or effectively or efficiently does not automatically correlate with intellect or cognitive function.
Oh, very true.
You can't assume that just because someone can't communicate clearly with you for whatever reason, that there isn't a will or an intent to communicate or cognitive function happening in the background.
So let me add to that real quick. So as I began to, you know, I was not intelligible. The only person that could understand me was my speech pathologist and maybe one nurse at Western Mass. And, you know, I think some social worker was like, do you want to go to NA meeting? Because he knew my history. Granted, I really have no need for meetings. You know, I'm very determined and like have no interest in substance abuse. But they rolled me down in my wheelchair to this meeting. I looked awful. I could barely talk. And someone made this point that I really wanted to speak to. And so I forget how I made it known that I wanted to talk, but I did, and I said maybe like one sentence. It probably sounded like blah, 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 blah. And like the whole room looked at me like, is this guy like fucking stupid or something? And I was just like, in my head, I'm like, you know, this really sucks. Like, maybe perhaps I'm one of the smartest people in the room, but because of how I sound, I'm dismissed as like a moron. And that's sad. And I think that happens like, I mean, I've even seen it here at my current hospital. There are people that are like cognitively intact that really don't sound nearly as good as I do. And they have to travel to an outside appointment with a card that's like they give the provider. I'm like cognitively intact. I am my own guardian. I can make my own decisions. But I mean, I've experienced that beforehand of just like going to an appointment and, you know, they're about to like rip off my big toenail. And I'm trying to tell them something very important. And it's gonna be like blah, blah, blah. And they're like, yeah, it's okay. I'm like, it sucks. Like, this guy has no idea what I'm saying, or does he even care? And then, yeah. So moving on.
All right, we're gonna take one last question and then wrap it up. And our last question is from Grace.
Okay.
So now I feel a lot of pressure at the end. But thank you, Jake, for talking to us.
Yeah.
So you actually answered most of my questions, but I was just wondering if during the period that you were locked in, if you noticed a difference in, like, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but maybe like the level of how maybe like lucid your thoughts were before you were able to communicate nonverbally and after, or were your thoughts kind of always the same regardless of your ability to communicate? Does that question make sense?
It does, and it's a
Okay.
very good question, especially to end this with. So I went through phases. I went through a period of actually hallucinating for about a month. Granted, when I was hallucinating, I was able to hold on to a grasp of reality, and I knew I was hallucinating. And then there was one period where my thoughts became, as I became nonverbal, I knew what I wanted to say. I think I did a pretty good job, but I'm like a perfectionist, and you'll notice some of my spelling was off. I even mentioned this to you, Michelle, and I was like, they were like relatively minor things, but for the most part, my thoughts were always there, especially internally. But when I wanted to express myself non-verbally, there were, I don't want to say confusion, but it was more like I'd be momentarily like flustered and I could spell the wrong thing or do a misspelling. Nothing too serious. Does that answer your question at all?
It does, definitely. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Well, Jake, I think I speak on behalf of everyone in the class. Thank you so much for your time, your story. I know your story inside and out, and it's every time I hear you talk, you're just incredible. And your motivation and what you've been able to accomplish is so inspiring, I think, to patients and to therapists and to basically anyone you come in contact with. I share.
That's what I want to do.
I know, and you're doing it well. I shared your blog link with the class. Is your contact info on there?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
It's on there. There's also in the About section of my YouTube page, there's a Contact Me button. And please feel free to just ask me whatever you want. I imagine there's more questions. And no one really touched on anything embarrassing, but you could if you want privately.
You're so great. I just love it. Okay, so we will end there, but I think I'm okay in saying reach out to Jake if you have questions. You can follow up with me if you have specific questions about anything we talked about tonight in terms of his recovery or our rehab together, his rehab trajectory in general.
So can I ask a question of the group? So I'm just curious, what do you think of my speech, you students?
Let's get some honest answers here, people. Jump in.
Yeah.
I could perfectly understand everything you were saying. You are, everything you said was clear,
Okay.
Yeah, same here. I can understand everything.
Cool.
And I think your prosody is coming along, Jake.
And what about the head bubbling?
Yeah, there's this, but that happens.
I don't like that. I'm working on it.
I wouldn't worry about it. I think you're just fine.
And one more. How many people think they're going to be involved with traumatic brain injury? If any.
It's so early, but I don't know yet, but I'm definitely interested in working in a hospital or a rehabilitation center, possibly.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Just curious here.
Yeah, I feel like at this stage in the game, learning about speech pathology, there's so much even that we're covering in our class. We pediatric on all through the lifespan. So you have to learn a little bit about it all, and then you decide where you're going to specialize. I think people have a gut feeling, though. I always knew I wanted to work with adults. Someone just put in the chat, I'm working with Mandy said, I'm working with a TBI client from another capacity currently. And thank you for sharing your story.
You're very welcome, Mandy. All right, I'll let you guys get on with your evening.
Thank you, Jake. This was wonderful. I will post the recording of this session to D2L, and Jake, I'll also send you a copy of it too, so you have it.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.